Hello everyone, in this video I will show you how to create biomes using the PCG framework in Unreal Engine 5.2. I will show you two different ways to do that. The first one will be using the surface sampler node, the second one will be using the spline sampler node, and the third one will be using a combination of both. So for this video I have two different assets that I will be using to show you different biomes. It is a very simple stylized tree that has green leaves and another one that has yellow leaves. So to start, I will go into the content browser to right click and look for PCG and then PCG graph. I will rename this graph into PCG graph forest. And if I open this new graph, there's actually nothing happening yet. So I will look for a surface sampler. I will then connect the landscape of the input into the surface sampler. And I will look for a transform point node. Then I will look for a static mesh spawner. And in the static mesh spawner, I'll add one entry. So I will spawn only one mesh, which is going to be a tree. So in this case, this is the very basic tree that I showed you first. Now I will save this and go back to our scene. And as we can see right now, there is nothing happening. This is because we need a volume into our scene. So I will add a new actor and I will look into volumes. Then I will search for PCG volume. And right now we can see that I'm spawning PCG volume here. However, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the scale from 1 to 10. And I'm going to move this volume a bit lower so it can touch the landscape. In the PCG volume actor, I will look into its components and we look for PCG component, then PCG, then graph instance, then instance, and I will drag and drop the PCG graph forest we created. Once I've done that, I can generate the content. So right now I generated a bunch of trees. And what I'm going to do, just for the sake of this video, is I'm going to change the points per square meter value of the surface sampler to have a lower value. This will allow me to spawn less trees. So here we only have a handful of trees. So to create a biome, a very simple way here is to actually duplicate everything. So I will duplicate my PCG graph forest. So right click on it, then duplicate. I will rename that PCG graph forest 4. I'm going to double click to open it, and we can see that everything is the same as the previous graph because we just pretty much copy everything from the previous graph into this new one. And in the static mesh spawner, instead of spawning the stylized tree that I had, I will spawn the stylized fall tree. And if I go back to my scene, nothing has changed yet. This is because I also need to copy and paste the volume. So I copied and pasted the first volume and I have another one. You can see that they're on top of each other, so I'm going to move the second one right next to the first one. As I just moved it, we can see that the trees being spawned are in a different position. This is because the location of the PCG volume number 2 is slightly different from the previous one, so it's spawning trees in a different place. If I go into the PCG component of this volume, in the graph instance, I don't want to have the forest one. Here I want to have the forest form one. And the moment I do that, I can see that I spawned the other trees. So here, I just created two different biomes. You can see already that there's a bit of a limit to this method. Pretty much everything you would spawn using this method will be bound to be in a box. Everything will be in a box. And in some situations, this might be what you want, and this might be very useful. It has also some advantages. For example, if you want to have a post-process volume in the scene, in this case, I will just show you what happens if I add a post-process volume. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the location of the first PCG volume into this new post-process volume. And I will change the scale to match that of the PCG volume, so 10. And we can see that pretty much the post-process volume has the exact same shape as the PCG volume. If I move the parts process volume, we can see it's not at the same spot again. And I just cancel that. So we can see here that the parts process volume is fitting perfectly with the PCG volume because everything is in a box. And this is very useful to apply post-processing volumes to whatever biome you have. So in this case, if I wanted this biome to be, let's say, very bright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the bloom here to a very high value. If I move the camera here, I'm using the normal volume. But the moment I go into this biome, then everything will look different. See? Everything is more intense because I changed the bloom. And you can apply that to the number of biomes you have to create different atmospheres. But once again, everything is limited by this box shape. An advantage to this method is that I can change the landscape and my trees will adapt to it. So this is why using the surface sampler connected to the landscape is really useful, because we can change and sculpt whatever landscape we want and everything will adapt to that. So this method has two main advantages. You can use post-processing to fit and match the boxes, the PCG volume boxes perfectly, and you can also use the landscape data to do whatever you want, change the landscape, and the PCG will adapt to that. However, as I just mentioned, everything is in a box, so this is why I'm going to talk about the second method, which is using spline data. So in this case, I will go back into my PCG graph, and I will disconnect the surface sampler. And I will look for spline sampler this time, and the get spline data node. In this situation, I don't need the input nor the surface sampler, so I'm going to move them a bit above. In the get spline data, I will change the actor filter from self to all world actors. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look for spline actors by tag. So at the moment, it's set to none. This is because there is no spline actor. We're going to create a spline actor right now. So right click in the content browser and blueprint class. I look for a actor. Now rename that BP spline. In the new BP spline, I'm going to look for an actual spline itself. So I'm going to click on add components and then spline. And the last thing I'm going to do here is in the spline component, I will search for closed loop. So the closed loop setting is really important here. I'm going to check this setting to be true. Now that I created my spline, I will right click on it, on the BP spline, and I will create a child. And then I will rename that BP spline forest. And I will create another one. And this time BP spline forest 4. And in the BP spline forest, I will look for the actor tag component. So if I click on the very top of the blueprint into BP spline forest self, then search for tag, I will be able to find the array of actor tags. In this case, I will rename that one spline forest. And in the second child, the BP spline forest 4, I will do the exact same thing. And I will rename that spline 4. So now that I created splines, I can actually use them in my PCG graph. So this time I will look for the spline forest tag. And I still have a warning here because this is perfectly normal. This is because I need to put that in the scene. But I will finish doing everything in the PCG graphs first. And what I just did for the PCG graph forest, I will have to redo all of that into the PCG graph forest form. So look for a spline sampler and get spline data. Connect everything together. Change the actor filter from self to all world actors and rename the selection tag to spline 4. So now everything should be fine. But right now in the scene, nothing is happening. As I mentioned before, I need to drag and drop the spline actors in our scene. And right here, we can see that we have trees being spawned. However, we can see that the spawning is a bit strange. This is because in each PCG graph, in the spline sampler, I need to change the dimension from on spline to be on integer. So I'm going to do that on both. And this is why in the BP spline, we check this setting, the closed loop, because we want to have a loop that is being closed. And this will allow to spawn things inside the loop. If it's not closed, we just have one line. So because I did that, and because my splines at the moment are pretty much empty, like if I go on them, I can see it's just one line. What I'm going to do is I'm going to press Alt, select one of the points of the spline, and I'm just going to drag it. And we can see that we have a closed loop here. I don't have to do anything, it's doing it automatically. So right now this loop is very small. And here we go. If I change its size, everything is being spawned inside the loop. Right now I can see I have a lot of trees, and I will change that in 1 second. I'm just going to spawn the 4 trees this time. So here we have the exact same problem. So back into the PCG graph, in the spline sampler node, I'm going to change the interior sample spacing node setting to a higher value. So here I'm going to change it from 100 to 500. And I will change the interior border sample sampling from 100 to 500 as well. I'll do that for both. And if I go back to my scene, I can see that there is way less trees being spawned. So I need to change the size of my loop again. So I'm changing my spline here to be bigger, so we have more space for trees to appear. So in this scenario now, we have way more control over the space where things can be spawned. We can choose the size as much as we want, create whatever shape we want with the spline. 2 things to keep in mind is that if you change one of the points to be very high or very low, things will not spawn properly. See, they spawn at the bottom. You kind of have to make sure that your spline is always next to the ground. In this case, we don't need to have a landscape. We can use whatever we want. But one main issue with this method is that the moment I go into the landscape mode and change Scalt, trees will be absorbed into the terrain. And compared to the surface sampler from before, it's not adapting to whatever landscape we have. In a previous video, I mentioned that we can change that by using a projection node. So this is something you can do. And the main issue with this method, compared to the surface sampler one, is that if you look into the surface sampler node, you can see that you can control different settings that control the different spawning points. You can change the points per square meter, you can change the point extents, you can change the looseness, you can also change the seed, so that can create more diversity, you have more control over what is being spawned and the size of what is being spawned. However, in the spline sampler, you don't have as much control. As you saw from this video, I can change the interior sample spacing value or the interior border sample spacing value, but that's pretty much it. This is the main drawback of just using splines. Sure, you can have whatever shape you want, and you're not limited to the box, but on the other hand, you're limited to how you can control things. And the other main drawback is that here, everything is spawned on a line. So if you look from above, this is where it's getting very obvious. Everything is on a line. Whereas if you use a surface sampler, everything is random, and you can change the seed to add more randomness, as I mentioned before. You can change a lot of other values. But this is not really the case with the spline sampler. So to fix this problem, there is the third method that uses a combination of both. And before I dive into this topic, I also want to mention that if you just want to use splines here, you can also adapt your post-processing volume to fit better than just being a box. If you go into the post-process volume actor and you look for shape, you see that the shape by default is box, but you can use, for example, a cylinder. And we can see that the shape is being different. This kind of makes up for the fact that you don't have to use a box every time, but you will have to adapt your spline to the post-process volume, or if you cannot really adapt, you have to tweak around to make sure that things kind of match each other. This is a side note on post-process volume and PCG volume put together. So now I'm going to show you how to use a combination of the surface sampler and the spline sampler node. So I'm back into the PCG graph forest, and I will connect again the landscape to the surface of the surface sampler. I will connect back the transfer points into the out of the surface sampler and disconnect the spline sampler from it. If I connect the spline sampler out point to the bounding shape, and if I save that, I can see here that my trees are being spawned inside the spline. Actually, they are slightly a bit outside, but they kind of fit the size of the spline. So if I change it, you can see that everything is still being spawned inside the spline. However, this time, if I look from above, it's not using lines, it's actually using the surface sampler node. And if I go into the landscape, and I change the landscape a bit, we can see that trees are actually adapting to the landscape this time. The combination of the spline sampler and the surface sampler is actually really useful, because you can spawn everything inside the spline and use the advantage of the surface sampler, which is a better control over points per square meter, the size of the points, the looseness, the seed, and it will adapt to the landscape. And so I will do that also with my full graph. So in this case, we can see that I have way more control of everything. And as I mentioned, I can change the landscape to kind of fit, but at one point it might be too much. Like my landscape right here, it's like a really, it's a bigger hill. And as I kind of mentioned in my previous video, you can have a projection node to fix this issue. I'm going to go into the forest full graph and I'm going to look for a projection node. I will connect the output of the spline sampler into the projection and then into the bounding shape, and the projection target will be the landscape. And if I go back into here, we can see that trees now adapt to the landscape even if it's really harsh compared to before. So this is pretty much it for this video. You can definitely play around those different settings and create different biomes. I strongly encourage you to also play around with the post-process volume to kind of create multiple post-process volumes depending on the biomes. This will add a lot of diversity into whatever you're building. And so I will see you in the next video. Bye!